Hello everyone and welcome to today's SANS at Mic Talk. My name is Kopřiva and today I will be your guide through the world of phishing. Now, what you may look forward to today, we will take a look at a couple of phishing tips and tricks. Some of these are currently used in the wild, some of them are not. And as a bonus, we will take a look at an unpatched vulnerability in Outlook, which Microsoft let me know just last week that they won't patch. So you will come away, hopefully, a bit more knowledgeable. I hope you will enjoy our podcast or webcast today. Before we get into it, a couple of words about myself. My name, as I've mentioned, is Kopřiva. I'm the team lead of Computer Security Incident Response Team at ALEF. I'm also one of the handlers at SANS Institute's Internet Storm Center. Now, I began my career as purely a blue teamer, but over the years I've moved somewhere between red and blue, and I think I will be forever lost just there. Now, why talk about phishing techniques? If you're a blue teamer, then of course you need to know what to look for. The attackers are either using some of the techniques we will be going over already, or they may do so in the future, who definitely may use some of the more advanced techniques against you are red teamers. Now, for the red side, why should we care about phishing? Well, for red teamers, definitely to get past the defenses on email gateways or over some other security controls. If you tend to do rather phishing tests, pure phishing tests, than a red teaming exercise, it's still good to know about some of the more esoteric techniques out there. Now, we will talk more towards the people on the red part of the spectrum, but I think that all of you, whatever you do, will come away knowing a little more than you did going in, hopefully. Now, what we will not go too deep into is social engineering. There are lots of great resources for that topic, plus every engagement is a little bit different from this point of view. So we will assume that you've already done all necessary open source intelligence gathering and analysis, and therefore you know where to send your email, your phishing email, to whom, and what type of message will look good to your target. Now, I've mentioned red teaming. Obviously, if you do red teaming, you're not limited to phishing, whether it's, as we may see in the MITRE attack, whether it's through attachments, links, or using some third party or third service. But usually, phishing is the simplest way to go. We all know that humans tend to be the weakest link in the security chain. And since phishing is specifically a social engineering attack targeting this weak chain, we have quite a good chance of success. Now, when we're talking about the weak chain, what may actually stop us if we try to use some phishing technique in order to compromise the target environment? Well, in the first place, it's actually the weak chain, the recipient. In cases when people are knowledgeable or security aware, they are probably the best type of defense against phishing, especially spear phishing, because bypassing security devices isn't so hard. But bypassing a really knowledgeable user, a really knowledgeable person, is usually not that simple. So we will take a look at a couple of techniques which will allow us, hopefully, to get past the recipient. But before we get to the intended target, to the person, we obviously need to get past the technical defenses. I'm talking specifically about things which may be set up on any email gateway, which is between us and the target. So what maybe you find there? Well, in first place, SPF or DKIM or DMARC globally checks, which may actually make our day a bit harder. We may find some content analysis filters, some heuristics, and also if we're sending either links or attachments, some detections specialized for these types of malicious or potentially malicious contents. Now, if we don't use email ourselves, but we're using third party to send the email, of course, the service provider who is the one sending the message might be the one to stop us as well. So let's start with the recipient. As I've mentioned, we won't go too deep with social engineering, but just a couple of basic truths about social engineering. Since we're sending a phishing message, we need certain level of cooperation from the recipient. We need them to either click something, open something, unzip something, you name it. So what do people in general react well to? Well, to anything that looks like it's from a known source, to anything that looks like it's from a trustworthy source, or to anything which looks like it's urgent, ideally when it looks like all three of these. But the point I want to make is that this is just part of the puzzle. What may help us, and help us quite a lot, might be something as simple as the time of day or the day when we send our phishing out. Now, Proofpoint published last year its human factor report, and in that they took a look at a number of phishing campaigns, and they came up with these charts. As you may see, imposter messages are most common on Monday, as are the malicious messages. Plus the malicious messages tend to start on Sunday. Why is that? Well, because what do we all do on Monday morning when we come to work? We open our email and we see lots and lots of different messages. We want to get rid of those as fast as possible. So I would say that Monday morning is probably the best time for your phishing if you're doing some sort of test or you are part of a red teaming exercise. But that's not all. Of course, the choice of a target will help us immensely in order to succeed with our phishing. As the meme says, can't fall for phishing scans if you don't check your email. Well, great and true, but there are certain people or people in certain departments who basically need to check every message which comes in their inbox. I'm talking about HR. They usually check all the CVs which come in. I'm talking about finance departments. They usually need to check all the invoices which come in. But a good target might as well be PR department or sales department, etc. Pretty much anyone who has it as part of their work to check nearly every email which comes in. So choosing one of these will give you greater chances of success than if you were to target an IT person, obviously. You probably won't get domain admin straight away if you target a salesperson or a PR person, but they may give you the first stepping stone inside a target environment, which is usually what we need from them. Now, if we were able to write an email on which our victim would actually click or they would open an attachment, we still need to get it past the technical defenses. Now, the first one we've mentioned is Sender Policy Framework, or SPF. Now, if you've never seen SPF, how it works, it's fairly simple. When we or someone sent an email, the first hop on its way is the sending email server, which will then transfer it to the recipient's email server. Now, what the recipient's email server may do, if it's configured in such a way that it checks SPF records, which it should be, is it will ask our DNS server whether a specific TXT record exists. Now, if it does, it will contain IP addresses of all the servers which may legitimately send email for the sender's domain. So in our case, supercorp0.com. Now, based on whether the sending email server's IP address is in this record or not, the recipient's email server will either deliver the message or it will throw it away. Sounds perfect, right? Does this mean that we can't actually spoof email if SPF is used? Well, not really, because unfortunately, in accordance with the RFC, originally it was RFC 4408, now it has been superseded by 7208. It only checks the mail from, but not the header from. There are two from information in email, and SPF only deals with the one which the user actually doesn't see. What the user does see may be spoofed fairly easily, and SPF will do nothing against that. Now, DKIM and DMARC can help us a bit in this area, as may other techniques and technologies which are in use on some email gateways, on some security gateways. But in general terms, SPF actually doesn't limit us that much. Or it may in certain cases, depending on how well the defender or our target has set up their email defenses. Now, if we want to spoof email for a domain which has a well-written SPF record, such as Google, then things will probably not end well for us. Pretty much any recipient server will determine that we have spoofed the email and will throw it away. But many domains actually don't have well-written SPF records. The one I'm showing now is for TNT.com. And if you take a look at its end, where there is a question mark, all, it actually says, after all the IPs and domain names which are defined as valid senders, all other servers or policy for all other senders is undefined, i.e. they may send emails for the domain or they may not. Nobody will stop them. So pretty much anyone may currently send emails for the domain TNT.com. And it's actually been happening for at least half a year. Their domain has been used and is currently being used to distribute malicious software. So a badly written SPF record may come to bite any organization fairly soon. But if we, during a certain red teaming exercise or pen test, want to send emails spoofing this domain, we may theoretically do so. Now, I will urge you not to send email for any domain for which you don't have specific permission, but you definitely could do it. So it's good to keep it in mind. Now, if we want to spoof an email, we may go the simplest way, i.e. use some online tool. Now, this usually won't work because most of these tools use email servers which are already on a number of blacklists, because script kiddies usually start with these tools and cause them to become actually noticed quite soon. But that doesn't matter that much to us. We may send or spoof an email manually if we want. It's not that hard. Since SMTP is a text-based protocol, nothing is stopping us from directly connecting to recipient's email server and just sending any email we wish. In this case, we may send an email as Count Dracula. And unless the IP address from which we were sending it was on a blacklist, or unless Transylvania.ro in this case has an SPF record, it should go right through. or in this case, even through an SPF record. So spoofing an email is nothing that hard. But we probably don't want to do it through Telnet. We will either in any case use our own server, usually somewhere in the cloud, but we may use some standardized tools such as SET, the social engineering toolkit, something you probably know from Kali Linux, or we may write our own tool. The second tool, which you may see here, is actually something I wrote a couple of years back when we needed to do a, let us say, more massive phishing campaign for one of our customers. But writing something like that isn't that hard. As we've shown, sending email using just Telnet is quite simple. But we don't necessarily have to be the ones to send a phishing email. We may use a third party. For example, pretty much any service which allows us to transfer files, because these services usually take a sender's email, but they don't necessarily validate it. So the target, in this case myself, will see that it comes from perhaps a legitimate sender, in this case CEO@hacking.training, which is my domain. So all right, this might be a file which I've been waiting for, and for some reason the sender decided to send it to me not through direct email, but using file mail, some external service. Now, in practice, if we want to go by the book and want everything to be legal, we are definitely limited by terms and conditions of any such service, and most of these have their terms and conditions written in such a way that we may not legitimately use it for similar phishing attempts, but you may find one which omits such a clause from their terms and conditions. Plus, attackers use these quite often in order to bypass defenses on recipient's end. Now, if we decide that we don't necessarily want to spoof an email, we still may actually make the email look a bit better to a recipient. In many cases, it's quite enough to just put in a good name. If a less than knowledgeable user sees the email came from financial support, why not trust it? In other cases, what we may do is put in a second, or what looks like a second email address. So it looks like it came from a legitimate domain. In our case, a legitimate domain would be alefsecdemo on Microsoft.com. And we will hope that the victim won't notice that it actually came from some other email. This is a technique which is quite often used by attackers, real-world attackers, which is the reason why most email security appliances and email gateways will catch it. For example, even O365 will catch it if the security defenses are well configured. If they're not, it might go through without any warning. So even such a simple technique might work quite well. But when we're talking about addresses, we have many other options as well. Simple character substitution may work quite well. For example, if we were to register domains such as paypi.com and just capitalize the I at the end, it looks like PayPal. It looks completely legitimate. RN Microsoft looks like Microsoft. Microsoft with 0 instead of O when capitalized looks almost legitimate. So this might work, but usually only in cases of targeted red teaming exercises. You definitely won't be able to register rnmicrosoft.com because Microsoft already holds it. Honestly, most of these, or most of the simple ones, are usually already pre-registered by the company whom you might spoof using them. Plus, detecting such simple substitutions is usually fairly simple for the security mechanisms in place. But we may go a bit different way. You've probably heard of the internationalized domain names homograph attacks. We will simply use a Unicode character which looks like a legitimate ASCII character, and in that case the domain might look quite well, at least when we write it down in an email and want the user to click it. In this case, the Microsoft on the right, you may notice that the I looks a bit different. That's because it's actually not a legitimate I, it's from one of the non-standard Unicode alphabets. And this domain name is actually not registered, as you may see. It's still available for registration. So if you want to have this Microsoft ID and homograph domain, you may register it. Now, it doesn't look as well once it's open in a browser. It will look like what you see at the bottom left. It's coded into what's called Punycode because DNS doesn't work well with Unicode, so we need to translate it into something which is ASCII based, which is what we see here. But we're not limited to this technique if we want our domain, or phishing domain for lack of a better term, to look legitimate. We may use higher level domains. Now, given how DNS is actually formalized and standardized, we may use up to, I believe, 127 levels of domains. So nothing is stopping us from using 5th level domain, which starts with www.paypal.com and then ends in some other domain. Now, the attackers use this quite often. I believe the maximum I saw in a real-life phishing was 11th domain or 11th level domain. But if you send an email in which you input a href, a link, to domains such as this one, well, a user who's not very security aware might take it as a legitimate domain. Plus, if you're a red teamer, you may register a domain which is reusable. For example, coms-en.cz. Well, it starts with com, so anything we put before that looks like it ends in .com. Why not click on it? Well, you can't register this specific domain, that's one of mine, but you see the principle. What's the bonus of this technique for us? Usually, the automatic detection fails, or usually sometimes it fails, definitely more often than with simple character substitution. But it's usually not a bad idea to combine these two vectors or these two techniques. If we try to send something to our target, to our victim, which actually points to a domain of, in this case, it's 4th level domain, www.paypal.my second level domain com-en.cz. As you may see, O365 and many other solutions will actually catch it as spam. Well, obviously, this is an obvious PayPal phishing because we've put in PayPal. But if we use character substitution and, for example, input a uppercase I at the end, so we have PayPy, in that case, it might get through. This is dependent on specifics of the target environment. So if you ever do some red teaming or some phishing testing, if you have any choice of whether to try it out beforehand on the same infrastructure which you're targeting, it's definitely not a bad idea. But we have still other options. If you know of any open redirects which look, well, that might be the best way to go. Now, what are open redirects? Many sites have a redirection mechanism inside of them, which will redirect the browser of a visitor to another site. Usually, it looks like what you may see in front of you. Well, even high-profile sites sometimes may contain open redirects, i.e. they don't limit where you may redirect the visitor to. So it's completely up to the person creating the URL. Now, historically, Washington Post had a fairly nice open redirect. Luckily, they patched it. It took them about 6 months, but that's a story for another time. But as you may see there, if I were to send something like this, the link points to washingtonpost.com, a legitimate domain. So why shouldn't the recipient click it? Well, because as you have probably gathered, they will be redirected to some other domain, in this case, untrustednetwork.net. Of course, we might obfuscate the final target using URL encoding and other techniques, but I think this is enough to prove the point. Still, other options we have when it comes to links. And this one is incredibly simple, but maybe very powerful, is to use a bit of social engineering. Now, if you've ever taught a security awareness class, I'm willing to bet that one of the things you've said is, if you're not sure of a link, just point to it and you will see a pop-up telling you where it leads. If it leads to a legitimate domain, you may click it. I have definitely taught people this. Well, it isn't usually, or it isn't always the greatest idea, because if a organization or if a user uses an email-based client, we may actually change the contents of the pop-up just using a simple title parameter in an A tag. So if I were to input this in an email, HTML formatted email, with title pointing to ics.sans.edu and leading to untrustednetwork.net, as you may see, when I point to the link, I will learn that it should probably lead to ics.sans.edu, but in truth, in the lower left corner, you may see it leads to somewhere completely different. Now, this is a screenshot from 0365. It is, I don't want to say vulnerable because it's not really a vulnerability, but it is susceptible to this type of attack or to this type of change, as is Gmail and as is pretty much any email-based email client I've ever tried it on. So if you know of any on which it doesn't work, definitely let me know. But for now, I would say that it works on most, if not all of them. Now, if we have a great link with domain which looks good, we still need some contents to add to it, because if we were to send just an email with a link, nobody would click it. Why should they? So we need to input some interesting text as well. Unfortunately, some of the words which would help us most from the social engineering point of view are the keywords which are usually detected, or through which is usually an email message marked as spam or phishing. For example, what looks good? Obviously, PayPal, Microsoft, any other large company, if we are trying to spoof a message which might look like it came from them. But some security email devices and solutions out there are a bit more paranoid, and they will flag anything which has, for example, a suspicious number of account words, or which has urgent in its subject or its contents. Most email solutions are fairly uncompromising when it comes to anything which is titled invoice. If it comes from an email address which is not necessarily trusted. For example, it's been registered just recently. So this might not be the way to go. But we want to use these words because these are the ones or other words which might be flagged, but which will give us the best chance of someone opening the attachment or clicking the link. So how may we actually get these words and other words past the detections? Now, there are a couple of techniques, most of them from ALEF, and we will take a look at few of them. First one is incredibly simple but works really well. Now, if we were to send an email such as this one with the link pointing to obviously a phishing domain, as you may see, O365 will stop it or will mark it as spam. If we want to bypass this, we may use what is called ZWASP, zero width space. What you may see before you is the encoding of different zero width spaces. Now, if I were to use these in the same email and just input them at the ideal places in certain keywords, what the email solution will see is actually word split into two with a space between them. So this is what the email security solution will see, but this is what the user will see. As you may see, O365 won't detect this as, even when its security is well set, won't detect this as phishing, even though it's still pointing to the same domain. So ZWASP, amazing technique, incredibly simple, works quite well. Another way we may go is using images. It's not as good as having text in an email because we usually can't make a click-through from the part which we mark as URL. The victim would have to just copy it or rewrite it into the address bar. But if we were to create an image such as this one and just input the image as the body of an email, well, what the victim or what the recipient would see would look like a completely normal email. Now, as I've mentioned, you can't copy the address, you can't click it because it's image, all of it is an image, but pretty much no solution on the market will stop it and say, look, this is definitely phishing or this is definitely spam. In some cases, it might be marked as suspicious, but it won't be quarantined by default. Of course, we don't have to put the image inside the email. We may just put in an image tag with the source pointing to some remote server under our control. But in this case, we would need the recipient to actually allow us to download the picture, which they won't usually do. But this brings us to another fairly nice technique, which also uses downloading of external content in emails. Now, although we don't usually think of email in such a way, email isn't necessarily static. Email, HTML formatted email, is like any other HTML page. And what we may use in a normal HTML page, we may sometimes use in email as well, and those are cascade styles. Avanan, or excuse me, in this case, Mimecast in 2017 published an attack called the Ropemaker. And it's a very simple, but also very imaginative type of attack. What they did, or what we may do, is input or use a CSS, and then based on the CSS. Based on the CSS loading, if the victim is willing to load the CSS or click there to download, in this case, it's not a picture, but external content. Based on what we put in the CSS, the contents of the email might change after the email has been delivered. Now, this won't work with all email clients. Many of them don't support CSSs, but Outlook does. And since we usually target organizations which use Outlook or which use Microsoft's products, this is not a bad way to go. Well, obviously, if we input what we've just saw here, it won't help us much. But if we create an email, such as the one you may see in front of you now, this looks like a complete gibberish. And even to the user, once the email is opened, it will still look like a complete gibberish, except for the first line. In case of incorrect formatting, allow loading of external content. Well, why shouldn't I? The email told me to do so. In this case, if we allow loading of external content, we will see anything which actually is set as first with the style, and we won't see anything which has the second. So suddenly the email becomes clear once the user allowed loading of external content. And this looks quite good. You may encode anything in this way, and if the user is willing to download external content, in this case the CSS, the result will be quite interesting, as you may see. Now, we might create a much better looking email than the one I've been showing you here, but you probably get the point. Now, what might we do with additional, let us say, parameters of the message? What sometimes helps and allows us to get past defenses might be just using forward or re. Sometimes email gateways or email security appliances tend to actually behave a bit differently towards messages which contain such as this. Sometimes they will work or they will allow us to bypass the checks. Sometimes they won't. It's really dependent on the specific engagement you're working on. But another point we may use is changing the target of either URLs or anything else, images, after the message has been downloaded. So after it went through the original scans or original security checks. Now, it won't work always. For example, the secure links, which are now in 0365, won't actually allow us to help ourselves in this way, but for some solutions, it might work. What might also work is another interesting technique called Zerofont from Avanan. It's similar to the ZWASP, which we've already shown. Basically, what we may do in order to send, for example, this message and get it past defenses is just input certain characters with font size 0, and it will pretty much bypass anything what's out there. But what about links? Well, we may still use it with links. We just have to have a domain which might look well even with some characters missing. For example, playplall.com. If we just take the L's and make them 0 font, or we make them 1 point large, because L large 1 point is almost invisible, and security solutions won't then detect it as a 0 font, it will go through pretty much like a hot knife through butter. So this is not a bad technique to use. In case we don't want to be dependent on URLs, what we might do as well is use attachments. Or rather, if I want to send an email such as the one I'm showing you now, but which points to a phishing domain or to my domain instead of the legitimate paypal.com, it will be caught pretty much anytime. But if we target organization which uses O365 or pretty much any other, but in O365 we have some additional bonuses, we may send such a message as an attachment, as an EML attachment. Now, EMLs have really simple text structure, so we may craft an EML file quite simply, and it might look quite well. If we send it to our victim saying, dear user, you didn't respond to our last warning, we are resending it in the attachment. When a victim opens it, they will see our message, the original one. But, and here's the nice point, if they use O365, what the Outlook in cloud will do, if we have sent the, or if we've crafted the message in the EML to look like it came from paypal.com, it will help us by putting next to it the logo of PayPal, even though the link still points to our phishing domain. Now, it doesn't work only with PayPal. Any organization for which Outlook 365 knows an icon, it will put it in there, as it did in the case of this EML, which I've crafted for myself. Now, since we've mentioned attachments, what should we do when we have an attachment which definitely will or which might trip some sort of security solution? Well, there are two main approaches. We will either send a dropper or downloader or injector, so some sort of more basic malicious, or in our case, yeah, let's call it malicious, piece of code, which will then either drop or download or inject the final code, the final payload, or we may send a malicious file or the exploit file itself. Now, both attacks or both approaches have their advantages and disadvantages. Plus, we may attach, for example, an HTML file containing a full credential stealing page, which is something which is quite often used currently. But back to our malicious files, one way to get these past the detection would be to put them in a password-protected file, password-protected zip. But we still need to get the password to the victim, to the recipient. Now, if we just put it in a text inside the email, some email solutions, some security solutions will actually try to decrypt the archive using words from the text. So how may we get past this? Well, just put the password in as an image. I'm not aware of any email or any security solution which would actually do OCR on images and then try them as passwords. So this might be a nice way of how to get our payload past the defenses on email gateway. Which actually brings us to a different point. What if we don't want someone to run our attachment, but we just want authentication hash? Because this is something which we may do quite simply with email. Well, it's, as I've said, simple. We may just put in a link which doesn't point to an HTTP server, but which points to our SMB server. And then when a victim clicks it, because it looks like any other link, yeah, their computer will try to authenticate against our server, and we might get their hash, which we may then crack. We may do the same thing with an image, try to load it from our SMB share. In this case, all the victim has to do is once again click and download pictures, and we will have their password hash. But, and here is where we get back to our attachments. We may do the same using an attachment. And the beauty of this approach is that the victim doesn't actually have to click the attachment. They just have to unzip it. Because LNKs and a couple of other files will actually try to initiate a network connection if they are displayed in a file explorer in Windows. So if we created the LNK which I've just showed you and attached it in a zip file to an email, if the victim were to unzip the attachment and just browse to the folder in which our LNK now resides, Windows itself would initiate the network connection and give us the user's authentication hash, which we may again crack. Now, this is great. It's a technique which is quite simple and works usually fairly well. But what's beautiful about it is, and I've actually not seen this published anywhere, so it's sort of a new spin. We may use the same technique for downloading files. As we've said, LNKs or Windows will try to initiate network connection in order to download some content. In this case, it's the icon of the LNK. If we set the icon not for our SMB server, or it might be our SMB server, but for an ICO file on our server, what will Windows do? Well, they will download the file into the path you may see in front of you and then display it. An example to show you that I'm not making this up. If we were to create this LNK and send it to our victim, if they were to display it, this icon would actually load on that LNK, even though it's from an HTTPS server, which is remote. Now, where the beauty comes in is that we don't necessarily have to download ICO files. The path, the URL or SMB, or excuse me, UNC path has to end in .ico, but when we are initiating an HTTP connection, we may put the .ico as a parameter, as in this case. So in this case, if we were to craft this sort of LNK, zip it, send it to our victim, were they to unzip it and access it, pretty much any antivirus solution out there would actually start screaming at them that they have an infection. In this case, it's just an ECAR test file, so no real infection, but it's quite nice. Plus, we may modify the LNK in such a way that it will, on clicking, it will open the downloaded file. So we may use this as a pretty much zero-touch downloader. I will discuss this technique a bit more in depth in an upcoming ICS diary sometime next week. So if you're interested, you may look at it then. But before we get to questions and answers, because I can see that there are some questions already, I wanted to share with you one more technique. I've already mentioned that there will be a vulnerability in Outlook. And this one is actually incredibly simple and incredibly fun. What if we, as the good guys, but as attackers as well, had a chance to change where a href links points to, but not when we are sending an email, but when the original recipient forwards it or replies to it? You might say, well, that would be a bit of a problem. And you would be right. Let me show you that I'm not making up that this actually works. Hopefully you can now see my inbox. And inside it, there's an email which I've sent to myself. Hey, Jan, check this out and share it with your friends in InfoSec. It's a great resource, SANS Internet Storm Center. If we click it, it will actually take us to the SANS Internet Storm Center. A great resource for InfoSec, definitely. But watch what happens when I forward this message to my friends in InfoSec. In this case, I will just forward it to myself to make it quick. And we will give Exchange and Outlook a couple of seconds. Here it is. Now that it's arrived, if I click the link, I didn't do anything in between. It has taken us to some other site. Now this isn't great. Now, how does this work? It turns out that Outlook sets anything, any content. It doesn't even have to be an href. It may be simple text or it may be an image to an href if it follows a link which contains an empty image tag or image tag with no target, no source. As you may see here, we have an href pointing to an untrusted network.net, which doesn't contain any text. It contains only an empty image tag. And after it, there's an href which points to sans.edu. Now, this is the exact mail which I had in my inbox. When the original recipient forwards it, Outlook will take out the image tag, it will take the end of the A tag, it will put it at the end of the email, which will make anything between the original href and the end of the email point to the URL which is inside of it. Incredibly simple, works well, and unfortunately, as I've mentioned, Microsoft let me know that they won't patch it because it's low impact. Yes, it is low impact, but as you may see, we may, as the good guys, have quite a lot of fun with it. Unfortunately, so may the bad guys. I actually found it in a phishing email. I believe it's because the phishing email was broken, not because it was an intentional exploitation of this vulnerability. But you may see more of this or detailed discussion of this vulnerability in tomorrow's Internet Storm Center's diary. So if you're interested, you may find more details there. Now, hopefully, you've learned something new about how to write a good phishing, how to obfuscate, for lack of a better term, your strings when you need to obfuscate them, how to use better phishing URLs, and perhaps you will find the use for the vulnerability which I just showed you. Thank you for your attention, and now we have time for questions if there are any. Oh, as I mentioned, there are, so let me take a crack at those. Question from Sivakumar. I observed a technique where image sent on email has embedded link, and link is completely legitimate. So post user browsing the link in image, it loads the malicious file for download. Any protection for this method of attack? Give me a second. I need to read it for a second time. I'm sorry, Sivakumar, you will have to. Legitimate URL is redirected to another URL. Yeah, when open redirects are used or a legitimate domain or legitimate web server has been compromised and is then used to redirect users to other sites, to potentially malicious sites, unfortunately, there's not much that we can do about this. O365 has its safe links, which is not a bad solution, but it can be bypassed if you use what is called cloaking, which is something which the bad guys use fairly often, i.e. you serve different content on the web server to Outlook or to Microsoft's bots and you serve different contents to users, then you may still get past safe links. So I don't think there is any solution which would provide you with a 100% defense against this. The only thing which may help is a little bit more paranoia on the part of the user, but if it's completely legitimate site, for example, one which they use often, so it might be used as a watering hole attack. In that case, there's really not much we can do against this. Perhaps blocking JavaScript execution in browser, but it still might not protect us completely. Where can you follow me for new updates? Either on Twitter. You may later download the slide deck. You will find the @ there, or on the Internet Storm Center pages, where I sometimes actually write something interesting about new phishing or perhaps some interesting attack techniques. Or you may take a look at my own site at untrustednetwork.net or .org or .eu, whatever. You're welcome. Anyone else has a question? It doesn't appear to be the case. So once again, everyone, thank you very much for your attention. I hope that you've enjoyed the webcast as much as I've enjoyed giving it. And I'll hope to see you all some other time. Thank you and have a pleasant day, evening, morning, whatever time it is in the time zone you're at.